So, this story starts in 2019, just a few years ago. We're in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Seattle, Washington. It's one of those neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone. You'd think it's a perfect place to raise a family. Good schools, nice parks, friendly neighbors who wave as they walk their dogs. It's peaceful. Our protagonist, Ryan, is in his mid-30s. He's got a stable job as a graphic designer at a mid-sized marketing firm, and honestly, life's been pretty good. You know, the whole American dream thing. A decent job, a house with a white picket fence, a beautiful wife, Laura, and a son, Lucas, who's 7. Ryan and Laura have been married for almost 10 years, and on the surface, they're the picture-perfect couple. They met back in college, fell in love quickly, and it seemed like they were destined to be together forever. They got married right after graduation, bought their first home a few years later, and then came Lucas. It's one of those relationships where everything seems smooth, but like most things in life, nothing ever stays perfect forever. I guess you could say Ryan's life seemed set on autopilot. He'd wake up, go to work, come home, eat dinner with Laura and Lucas, maybe watch a show, go to bed, and repeat. But somewhere along the way, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything that hit him over the head at first. It was more of a nagging feeling, a sense that something wasn't quite right. You ever get that feeling? Like when you're walking down a path, and all of a sudden, you realize the ground beneath you feels different. That's how Ryan felt. Everything was still in place. His wife, his son, his job, but deep down he knew something had changed. But the tricky part? He wasn't sure exactly what it was. At first, he chalked it up to the normal routine. Life, after all, gets repetitive. You've been married for almost a decade, you've got a kid, and the days just blur together. But what Ryan didn't realize was that while he was caught up in his daily grind, Laura was feeling something completely different. Laura had always been the kind of person who wore her emotions on her sleeve. When she was happy, you knew it. When she was sad, you could feel it in the room. But recently, she'd become distant. Not cold, but distant in a way that was hard for Ryan to put his finger on. She stopped talking as much about her day, started spending more time at her sister's place, and when she did talk, it was always about the same things: work, the house, Lucas, the usual. But never anything personal. Ryan didn't think much of it at first. He figured she was just stressed, maybe a little overwhelmed with the pressures of work and motherhood. But as the months went on, that feeling of distance grew. And that's when it happened. One night, Ryan came home from work a little earlier than usual. It had been a tough day at the office, so he thought he'd surprise Laura and maybe take her out to dinner. He walked through the door, expecting the usual routine. Laura in the kitchen, Lucas playing with his toys in the living room. But what he found instead knocked him off his feet. Laura wasn't in the kitchen. Lucas wasn't in the living room. But there was a sound coming from upstairs. A noise that made his heart drop to his stomach. It was Laura's voice. But it wasn't the usual, "Hey, honey, how was your day?" kind of tone. No, this was different. This was soft, almost intimate. Ryan stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, listening carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. The more he listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't just Laura. There was another voice. A man's voice. Ryan didn't move for a few seconds. He wasn't sure if he was hearing things. But the longer he stood there, the more real it sounded. He slowly made his way upstairs. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew he had to see for himself. As he crept up the stairs, the voices grew clearer. And then, without even realizing it, Ryan found himself standing at the door to their bedroom, listening to the conversation between Laura and the man. He had to know what was going on, but he didn't know how much he could take. His heart raced faster with every word that came from the room. Finally, he couldn't take it any longer. He pushed the door open just a crack, enough to peek inside. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. Laura was sitting on the bed, talking softly to a man Ryan didn't recognize. He had a rugged look about him, dark hair, a scruffy beard, and a relaxed, confident posture that made Ryan's stomach churn. But it wasn't just the man that shocked Ryan. It was the way Laura looked at him. Her eyes were soft, her smile gentle, different from the way she'd ever looked at Ryan. They were sharing an intimate moment, laughing together, clearly comfortable in each other's presence. There was a warmth in their connection that Ryan hadn't felt in their relationship for months. The realization hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a friendly chat. This wasn't some casual hangout. There was something deeper, something more than just a friendship. Laura was cheating on him. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had just discovered. He wanted to walk in, confront them both, but his body froze. How could he face her? How could he look at this man? This stranger who had taken his place. Ryan stood there, hidden behind the door, watching as Laura laughed with the man. Every second stretched out, as if time had stopped and every painful truth was unfolding right in front of him. And just as he was about to turn and walk away, something unexpected happened. Laura's voice, filled with a sincerity that stung, called out to him. "Ryan, I'm sorry. I never meant for you to find out this way." Ryan didn't know how to respond. The words felt stuck in his throat, and his whole body trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. His world was falling apart, and all he could do was stand there in the doorway, paralyzed by the truth. Ryan stood frozen at the door, his hand still gripping the doorknob as Laura's voice echoed through the room. "Ryan, I'm sorry. I never meant for you to find out this way." That was the moment everything shifted. It was as if time slowed down, the reality of what was happening settling heavily on his chest. He could barely breathe. How had it come to this? How had he missed all the signs? At first, Ryan didn't know what to do. Should he walk away? Confront them? He wanted to scream, to throw something, but all he could do was stand there, a mixture of anger, hurt, and confusion overwhelming him. "Ryan, please, say something." Laura's voice broke through his thoughts, softer now, almost pleading. But it wasn't enough to close the gap between them. Not after everything that had happened. It was too late for apologies, too late for explanations. With a shaky breath, Ryan stepped back from the door, closing it gently behind him. He didn't want to be there, not like this. He needed time. Time to think, time to process. He turned away from the door and made his way downstairs. Every step felt heavier than the last. His mind was racing. What did this all mean? His wife, the woman he had built a life with, the mother of his child, she had been seeing someone else. And not just anyone. His best friend, Doug. It was a betrayal on every level. Ryan had always thought he could trust Doug. They had been friends for years. They'd shared everything. Career struggles, personal victories, even the occasional late-night talk about their relationships. And now it felt like all of that was a lie. Doug had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. And Ryan had no idea how to deal with that. Sitting in his car in the driveway, Ryan stared at the steering wheel. His hands were trembling. He'd left the house in a daze, not sure where he was going, but he just had to get away. His thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. Betrayal, rage, confusion. He thought about the years he had spent with Laura, the love they once had. He thought about Lucas, his son, who was asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. What was he supposed to do now? His entire world felt like it was collapsing around him. He sat there for a while, just breathing. The cool night air was calming, but his thoughts kept spiraling back to Laura and Doug. He could hear their laughter in his mind, see their smiles. He had never imagined his best friend could hurt him like this. After what felt like hours, Ryan started the car. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew he couldn't just sit there. He needed to get some space, away from the house, away from everything. As he drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, Ryan's mind kept returning to the idea of confrontation. Should he go back to the house and confront Laura and Doug? Should he just walk away from everything? Was it even worth saving? He couldn't get the image of Laura and Doug together out of his head. They had shared a bond, something more than just friendship, more than just affection. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the deep betrayal of trust, the feeling of being made a fool of by two people he loved and trusted. Eventually, Ryan found himself in a park, parked at the edge of the empty lot. The city lights glimmered in the distance, but the park was dark, quiet, just what he needed. He sat there for a while, letting the stillness wash over him. He needed to clear his mind before he made any decisions. But nothing could make the hurt go away. Why? Ryan whispered to no one. Why Doug? Why her? His voice cracked, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He sat there, staring out at the empty park, his emotions running wild. He thought about the man he had been, the man he wanted to be for his son, for his family. But it felt like everything was slipping away. And just like that, his phone buzzed. Ryan picked it up, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the message. It was from Laura. I know you're angry. I know you're hurt. But I didn't want it to end like this. Can we talk when you get home? The message stung. It felt like another lie, another half-hearted attempt to fix something that couldn't be fixed. How could they talk? What could she possibly say that would make it okay? Ryan didn't respond. He couldn't. Instead, he sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had never felt so alone in his life. It took a while before Ryan felt ready to go back. The hours ticked by, and he knew he couldn't stay in the park forever. Eventually, he started the car again, the drive back home feeling like the hardest part of his day. Every mile that brought him closer to the house felt like another piece of his soul breaking off. When he pulled into the driveway, he hesitated. He didn't know if he was ready to face her, or if he was ready to face the man who had been his best friend. But he had to. This couldn't stay in limbo forever. The house was quiet when he walked in. Laura was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying. She didn't look up when he walked in, but Ryan could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Ryan, she said softly, her voice cracking, I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know how things got here. Ryan didn't say anything. He didn't know how to respond. He wanted to yell, to scream at her, to ask her how long this had been going on, how long she had been seeing Doug behind his back. But no words came. Laura stood up, taking a step toward him, but he held up his hand to stop her. Don't, Ryan said, his voice low and controlled. Just don't. I need space. She flinched, but Ryan didn't care. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about him. And it was about the mess they had made of everything. Ryan, please, Laura began. But Ryan didn't want to hear it. He turned and walked toward the door. I'll be in my office, he said over his shoulder. I need some time to think. And with that, he shut the door behind him. Ryan sat in his office, the door closed, the lights off, and the air thick with silence. The reality of everything felt suffocating, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he couldn't think straight. His mind was cluttered with flashes of the past few days. Images of Laura's tear-streaked face, Doug's apologetic tone, his own internal battle between betrayal and confusion. He hadn't been able to get any rest, and everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. For the first time in years, the one thing he was sure of was uncertain. His marriage, the life they had built together. Everything felt like it was crumbling before his eyes. But deep down, Ryan knew that this wasn't just about his wife's affair with Doug. It was about a realization that had begun to gnaw at him since that fateful night. He had missed something. He had missed being there, missed being the husband she needed. Had it always been like this? Had he always been so absorbed in work, in solving problems, that he had neglected everything else that mattered? He hated the idea, but a small part of him wondered if maybe this mess was his fault too. He knew Laura had been unhappy for a while now. She tried to tell him, but he hadn't been listening. Not really. He'd been too busy, too focused on everything else. What had he thought? That everything would be okay if he just kept working harder? It was a bitter pill to swallow. But that wasn't the full truth, was it? Doug had crossed a line. His best friend, the man he'd trusted more than anyone. And that betrayal was still fresh, raw. No amount of self-reflection was going to change the fact that Doug had gone behind his back, had chosen to be with his wife while Ryan had been completely in the dark. The door to the office creaked open, and Ryan looked up, startled. Laura stood in the doorway, her face still puffy from the tears she'd shed earlier. She hadn't given him any space to think, had she? She had followed him here, knowing full well that he needed time alone. But now, standing before him, she seemed almost desperate. Ryan, please, I know I've hurt you, she said, her voice shaky. But we need to talk about this. We need to figure out what comes next. Ryan's heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment, he was speechless. The audacity of her words, the way she just walked in, as though nothing had happened, felt like a slap in the face. Figure out what comes next? He repeated bitterly, standing up abruptly. What, you think we're just going to move on from this? That we can work through this like it's some kind of misunderstanding? Like it's all just going to blow over? Laura winced at his words, but she didn't back down. No, Ryan, that's not what I'm saying. But we can't just ignore it. We have to make a decision. We have to figure out how to move forward. For Lucas, for the life we've built. Don't use Lucas as an excuse. Ryan cut in, his voice hard. This is about us. This is about what you've done, what we've both let happen. He was pacing now, his thoughts all over the place. His anger was starting to get the better of him, but he couldn't help it. His emotions were a storm, raging, uncontrolled. I trusted you. I trusted Doug. And look where that got me. Laura stepped forward, her eyes pleading. Ryan, please, I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake, and I regret it. I didn't want to hurt you, but I was lonely. I felt like you were slipping away, like I wasn't enough for you anymore. Ryan's stomach twisted. The pain of her confession was almost unbearable. It was hard to listen to her speak like that, especially knowing that she wasn't just talking about him. She was talking about Doug, the man she had turned to. Don't make excuses, Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. You made a choice. You knew what you were doing. She flinched but didn't respond. Ryan ran his hands through his hair, frustration and helplessness washing over him. The silence between them felt heavier than any words they could speak. He didn't know what he wanted to hear anymore. Did he even want to save this marriage? Could he? For the longest time, the only thing he could think about was what had been lost. What could have been had they worked things out. But now, with every word Laura spoke, Ryan could feel his grip on that hope slipping. I don't know what to do, Laura, Ryan said quietly, his voice hoarse. I don't know if I can forgive you. She took another step closer, her eyes wide with fear and regret. I understand if you can't. I know I've destroyed everything. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Ryan shook his head. He didn't know if her apology meant anything anymore. He had heard it too many times, her apologies, Doug's. Nothing felt real anymore. Nothing could erase the damage. As Ryan sank into the chair at his desk, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He couldn't look at Laura, couldn't stand to see her standing there, looking so small, so vulnerable. She was the one who had caused this mess. She was the one who had chosen Doug over him. But then again, maybe they were both to blame. Maybe they had both failed each other in ways they hadn't even realized. Maybe it wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything they had neglected over the years. Laura's voice interrupted his thoughts. Ryan, I know this is hard, but you have to make a choice. We can't keep living like this. It's tearing us apart, and it's hurting Lucas. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Lucas, their son. He had to think about Lucas. Ryan ran his fingers over his face, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside him. He knew she was right. They couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. They needed to decide what came next. I don't know if I can keep doing this, Ryan said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can look at you the same way. Laura's face crumpled, and tears filled her eyes again. I know, and I'll understand if you want to walk away. I'll understand if you need space. But please don't let this destroy everything we've built. Ryan stood up, his heart heavy. I don't know what's left to build, Laura. You've already torn it down. He turned away from her, his mind spinning. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep pretending to be okay. At this point, the tension has risen dramatically, and the emotional stakes are high. Ryan is torn between the love he still feels for Laura and the betrayal he cannot seem to shake. He knows he needs to make a decision, but the road ahead feels unclear. As the days passed, Ryan found himself in a state of constant emotional conflict. He was stuck between his desire to fix the broken pieces of his marriage and the undeniable anger he felt toward Laura and Doug. Every time he saw Laura, all he could think about was the betrayal. Every time he thought about Doug, his stomach twisted in fury. But it wasn't just about the affair. It was about the years of neglect, of feeling invisible in his own marriage. He didn't want to be the type of man who threw away everything he had. But how could he just move on as if nothing had happened? How could he look at Laura or even Doug the same way after everything that had transpired? One evening, after another long day of work, Ryan decided to take a walk. He needed to clear his head, to find some semblance of peace, even if it was fleeting. The cool evening air was a welcome contrast to the suffocating heat inside his own home. The house he shared with Laura, the home where their life together had slowly unraveled over the years. As he walked along the quiet streets, his mind raced. He thought about their early days together, the way they used to laugh, the way they dreamed about their future. The love they once shared felt so real then. But now everything seemed like a lie. Ryan stopped at a park bench, his gaze falling to the ground as he tried to gather his thoughts. He felt so lost. This wasn't supposed to be how things turned out. But here he was, staring at a crossroads, with no clear path ahead. He thought about Lucas, their son. He couldn't let this mess affect him, could he? He had to keep it together for Lucas. But the pain was overwhelming, and the guilt gnawed at him. Was it too late to fix things? Was there any hope left? Ryan! A voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him out of his internal struggle. Ryan looked up to see Laura standing a few feet away. Her face was tear-streaked, her expression one of both desperation and regret. He felt a sharp pang of something. Maybe anger, maybe sorrow, maybe a mixture of both. But he didn't say anything. He just stared at her, unsure of what to feel or how to respond. "I know you're hurting," she began, her voice shaky. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back. But please, I need you to hear me out. I need you to know I didn't want any of this. I never meant for it to happen. I don't want to lose you." Ryan stood up slowly, his mind still clouded with rage and confusion. "You don't want to lose me?" he repeated, the bitterness in his voice cutting through the air. "You want me to believe that? After everything? You've already lost me, Laura. Don't you get that? You've lost me because you chose him over me, over us." Laura's face fell, and she reached out, but Ryan stepped back instinctively. He couldn't let her close to him right now, not when everything was still so raw. "Please, Ryan," she said, her voice cracking. "I know I messed up. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even comprehend. But I'm willing to do anything to fix this, to fix us. I'll fight for us, I swear." Ryan shook his head, his anger flaring again. "How can I believe you? How can I trust you again after everything you've done?" His voice rose, and he could feel his chest tighten with the force of his emotions. "You didn't even think about me, Laura. You didn't think about our family, about Lucas. You just went for it. You chose him. And now you want to fix it." Laura's eyes filled with tears again, and she stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached out for him. "I never wanted to hurt you, Ryan. I never wanted to hurt our family. I made a huge mistake, and I know I can't take it back. But I want to fix this, please. I want to make things right." Ryan stared at her for a moment, his mind spinning. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the remorse in her voice, but it didn't change what had happened. It didn't change the fact that she had betrayed him. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Laura," Ryan said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can look at you the same way again." The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, as the weight of everything they had lost hung in the air. Ryan wanted to say something, anything, to make this pain stop, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ryan spoke again. "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know if there's anything left to save." Laura's face crumpled, and she collapsed onto the bench beside him. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Ryan stood there, watching her, torn between the love he still felt for her and the betrayal that still burned deep inside him. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the pain for both of them, but he couldn't. The damage had been done. The trust was shattered. "I don't know what to do," Ryan repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again. I don't know if I can ever forgive you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation pressed down on them, the realization that this was the beginning of the end of their marriage. Laura stood up slowly, her face still red from crying, but there was a look of determination in her eyes now. "I won't give up, Ryan. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll fight for us. I'll fight for our family." Ryan didn't know how to respond to that. He didn't know if he could believe her, but the idea of losing everything, his marriage, his family, was too much to bear. "I don't know if you can fix this, Laura," Ryan said, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if I can fix this, but I'm not ready to give up yet. I'll need time, though. Time to figure things out." Laura nodded, a small glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes. "I'll give you all the time you need. I need you to know that I'm sorry, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Ryan didn't respond. He didn't know if he could ever truly forgive her, but for the first time in a long while, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them to rebuild, to find a way forward, even if it meant facing the pain head-on. But that wasn't going to happen overnight. Couldn't. Trust was something that had to be earned, and Ryan wasn't sure if Laura could ever truly earn it back. The night stretched on, and as they stood there in the dim light of the park, the world around them felt strangely still. Their marriage was on the edge, teetering between the possibility of repair and the inevitability of its collapse. The tension is palpable as Ryan and Laura struggle to navigate their shattered relationship. Can they find a way back to each other, or is it too late? Stay tuned for the next chapter as the stakes continue to rise. Ryan spent the next few days in a haze, his mind constantly at war. He was torn between wanting to fix things with Laura and feeling like he would never be able to trust her again. Every time he thought about the betrayal, his blood boiled. Every time he saw her, his heart ached. It was a constant emotional tug-of-war, and no matter how much he tried to focus on his work, his thoughts kept drifting back to her and to Doug. The nights were the worst. He'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every interaction with Laura, and trying to piece together what went wrong. Where had he failed? What had he missed? But what hurt most was not just the betrayal. It was the realization that he'd been so wrapped up in his work, so focused on his career, that he hadn't noticed the cracks forming in his marriage. Laura had been asking for his attention for years. She'd asked for him to be present, and yet he had always put his job first. He thought he was doing it for them, for their future. But now, as he lay there in the dark, it was clear. He had been neglecting her, emotionally shutting her out, and now it was too late. It wasn't just the affair. It was everything that had led up to it. The cold dinners, the missed birthdays, the weekends he spent buried in his office while she quietly suffered. Doug had come in, not to be the villain in the story, but as a friend who stepped in when Ryan wasn't there. He didn't just swoop in on Laura's emotional vulnerability, he capitalized on it. He'd given her the attention, the care, the love that Ryan had failed to provide. Doug wasn't the problem, Ryan realized. It was his own inability to see what was slipping through his fingers. Ryan wanted to hate Doug. He wanted to feel the surge of anger when he thought about him. But Doug hadn't done anything Ryan hadn't already done to himself. Doug had just been there at the right moment. That was the truth Ryan didn't want to face. The next confrontation came when Ryan saw Doug at a work event. His pulse quickened the moment Doug entered the room. Their eyes locked for a split second, and Ryan could feel the tension immediately. It was as if the air itself had thickened, the silent acknowledgement of everything that had happened hanging between them like an unspoken challenge. Doug was the first to approach, his usual smile plastered on his face. But Ryan could see the unease in his eyes. Doug, for all his bravado, wasn't prepared for the storm he'd unwittingly triggered. "Hey, Ryan," Doug greeted, his voice light, but there was a hesitation in it, a subtle shift. "How's it going?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, staring at Doug, trying to find the right words. He wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but the truth was, he had no idea what he wanted from this confrontation. Part of him wanted to tear into Doug, to make him feel the pain that Ryan had been carrying around for weeks. Another part of him just wanted to understand why Doug had done this to him, why he hadn't been the friend Ryan thought he was. "You really want to do this here?" Ryan finally asked, his voice low and controlled. His pulse was racing, but he didn't let it show. Doug glanced around the room, clearly trying to gauge the situation. "Look, man, I know things are complicated, but I'm not trying to make this worse. I just want to talk." Ryan could barely contain his fury. "Talk? Talk about what? About how you and my wife tore everything apart? How you've been lying to me for months? Or do you want to talk about how you took everything from me? My marriage, my trust, my family?" Doug's face fell, and he looked genuinely remorseful. "I never wanted to hurt you, Ryan. You've been my best friend for years. But I'm not going to pretend this is something that didn't happen. Care about her. I care about Laura. I never meant for it to get to this point." Ryan shook his head, feeling his anger boiling over. "You didn't mean for this? You didn't mean to destroy my family?" His voice grew louder, but Ryan forced himself to step back. This wasn't going to help. They were just two men, locked in a battle neither of them truly wanted. "You knew what you were doing, Doug, and you did it anyway." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Doug looked like he was searching for something to say, something that could make this right. But there was nothing left to say. The truth was ugly, and no amount of words could fix it now. "I'm sorry," Doug said quietly. "I really am. I didn't realize how deep it had gotten until it was too late." Ryan didn't trust himself to respond. Instead, he turned and walked away. He couldn't do this right now. He couldn't face Doug anymore. He needed time to think. That night, he found himself back at home, sitting in the dark in his office. Laura had called, sent texts, tried to talk to him, but Ryan wasn't ready for any of it. He wasn't ready to hear her apologies, her explanations. He wasn't ready to forgive her. Not yet. Not after everything. As he stared at the screen, trying to focus on work, his mind kept drifting. He thought about his son, Lucas, and how all of this was going to affect him. No matter how hard he tried to shield him from the fallout, Lucas was going to feel the change. His family was falling apart, and there was nothing Ryan could do to stop it. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Laura. "We need to talk." He stared at it for a long time. How many times had she said that over the past few weeks? How many times had they promised to talk, to fix things? The answer was always the same, nothing changed. And Ryan didn't know if he could trust her anymore. He didn't know if he could even look at her without feeling betrayed. Still, he couldn't avoid it forever. Taking a deep breath, he stood up from his desk and headed for the living room. Laura was sitting on the couch, her face unreadable, her posture stiff. She looked up when he entered, but neither of them said anything at first. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Laura spoke. "Ryan, I know things are bad. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't undo. But please, I need you to understand that I'm trying. I'm trying to make this right. I'm trying to fix the mess I made." Ryan stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. His heart was heavy with all the anger and pain that had built up inside him over the past few weeks. He wanted to scream, to throw everything in her face. But he also wanted to hear her out. He wanted to believe that she could change, that she could truly understand the weight of what she had done. But did he even believe that? Could he really trust her again? "I don't know if I can do this, Laura," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can live with this." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Neither of them moved. Neither of them knew what to say next. Things are escalating quickly now. Tension is at an all-time high as Ryan faces difficult choices. Will he be able to forgive Laura? Or will the damage be too much to overcome? Stay tuned for the next chapter as the stakes continue to rise. As the days passed, Ryan tried to hold everything together. He could feel the tension building up inside him, a pressure he could no longer contain. Laura's attempts to mend the relationship seemed hollow, and each apology she made felt like another reminder of how deeply she had hurt him. The emotional weight of the affair lingered between them like a shadow, casting everything they said or did in a new light. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about how Laura had chosen someone else. Someone who wasn't there for the family. Someone who didn't have to carry the weight of responsibility that Ryan had. Doug wasn't the one who had to face the consequences of his actions. Doug wasn't the one who would have to explain to their son why his parents were no longer together. Ryan was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. His mind was constantly spinning, trying to make sense of everything. He wasn't sure if he even knew who he was anymore. His job, which had always been a source of pride, felt meaningless now. It was as though the foundation of his life had cracked, and he was struggling to find solid ground again. One night, after another tense conversation with Laura, Ryan found himself sitting alone in his office. His thoughts were racing, but his mind couldn't focus. He looked at the clock. It was late, and Laura had gone to bed. He was supposed to be fixing things, supposed to be making decisions, but he didn't know where to start. His heart was still heavy, filled with anger, disappointment, and a deep sadness that he couldn't shake. That's when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Doug. "Ryan, we need to talk." Ryan's hands trembled as he stared at the message. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this. He didn't want to hear Doug's excuses or apologies, but the text had an edge to it. There was something different about this message. Something that told Ryan that this wasn't going to be the same as the last time. He didn't think. He just responded. "Where?" The next day, Ryan met Doug at a small, nondescript cafe, one that was far enough from work to avoid any prying eyes. Doug was already sitting at a corner booth when Ryan arrived. His expression was grim, his shoulders tense. The moment Ryan slid into the seat across from him, Doug didn't waste any time. "I know I messed up, man," Doug started, his voice low. "But it's not what you think." Ryan's pulse quickened. He'd heard these words before, and they never made him feel better. They only made him feel more powerless. "I don't need you to tell me how you messed up, Doug. I already know that. You destroyed everything." Doug looked down at his hands, clearly avoiding Ryan's gaze. He seemed uncomfortable, as if he was bracing for a storm. "I get it. You hate me right now. But hear me out. I never meant for any of this to happen." Ryan leaned forward, his eyes locking with Doug's. "You didn't mean for it to happen? What exactly were you trying to do, Doug? Were you trying to make me the villain in this story? Because that's what it feels like. Like I'm the bad guy, and you're just the guy who was there to pick up the pieces." Doug flinched, but didn't speak right away. Ryan could see him grappling with his own guilt, and it made him feel sick. "I wasn't trying to be a hero, Ryan. I was just trying to be there for Laura when you weren't." Those words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. He wanted to shout, to tell Doug how wrong he was, but something in him stopped. Doug wasn't the one who had caused this, it was Ryan. His own neglect, his own inability to put his family first had created the perfect storm for this affair to happen. Doug was just a symptom of something much bigger. Ryan closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had to stay in control. He had to stay calm, because if he didn't, he wasn't sure he could stop himself from doing something he'd regret. "Tell me everything," Ryan said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "Tell me everything about you and Laura. I need to hear it from you. I need to understand why." Doug hesitated, looking around nervously before he spoke. "It started slow. First, it was just us hanging out. She needed someone to talk to. You were always at work, and you weren't there. She told me how lonely she was, how she felt like you didn't notice her anymore." Ryan's heart sank, the words cutting through him like a knife. He knew it was bad, but hearing it out loud made it feel worse. "She told me how much she loved you, Ryan, but she also told me how empty she felt. She was waiting for you to notice. She was waiting for you to step up." Ryan's chest tightened. He couldn't speak for a moment. Everything Doug was saying felt like a mirror being held up to his own failures. Doug continued, his voice quieter now. I didn't set out to hurt you. But when she started talking to me, I guess I started listening more. And it just happened. Ryan's fists clenched under the table. He wanted to punch Doug. He wanted to lash out. But something inside him was holding him back. He couldn't blame Doug entirely. The real blame was on him. Doug looked up, meeting Ryan's eyes. I never meant for things to go this far. And I'm sorry, Ryan. I'm truly sorry. Ryan didn't know what to say. His head was spinning. He had so many questions, so much anger. But there was no simple answer. No quick fix. He felt lost. Are you still seeing her? Ryan finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Doug shook his head. No. It ended. I ended it. The silence between them felt suffocating. Ryan couldn't bring himself to say anything more. He was done. Done with Doug. Done with the lies. Done with the hurt. Doug stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm sorry, man. I really am. I just wanted to explain. I thought you deserved the truth. Ryan didn't respond. He just watched as Doug walked away. He felt numb, as though the life had been drained from him. There was nothing left to fight for. Back home, Laura was waiting for him, but he didn't want to face her. He didn't want to hear her words, her apologies. He didn't know if he could ever forgive her, but part of him knew that he had to, if only for their son, Lucas. But before he could go inside, he stopped himself. The house that had once felt like a home now felt foreign to him. He couldn't escape the weight of everything that had happened. The realization hit him. He had no choice but to confront it, no choice but to face what had been broken. Ryan walked inside, determined to find some sort of peace. But the question was, could he ever truly forgive Laura? And would their family ever be the same again? Tension is at its peak, and everything is hanging by a thread. Ryan has heard the truth from Doug, but will it be enough to move forward? Stay tuned for the next chapter as the stakes continue to rise. As the days passed after Ryan's meeting with Doug, things began to settle into an uneasy rhythm. It was like the calm before the storm, a delicate silence that hung between him and Laura. Neither of them had spoken much since that conversation. The house, once filled with the laughter of their son and the warmth of shared moments, now felt cold and distant. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, but he wasn't sure what. There were no more tears or accusations, no more heated arguments. Everything had fallen into this quiet space of unresolved tension. Laura had given him space, just as he had asked, and it seemed like both of them were waiting for the other to make the next move. But what move was left to make? At night, when the house was quiet, Ryan found himself replaying everything that had led up to this moment. The affair, Doug's betrayal, his own failure to truly see what was happening in his marriage. All of it swirled in his mind like a whirlwind. He had been too focused on his work, too determined to provide a life for his family. But in doing so, he had ignored the very thing that made everything worthwhile, the people he loved. The realization hit him harder than he ever imagined. But it was too late for regrets. Ryan knew he couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. One evening, as he sat on the couch, watching their son play with his toys on the floor, Ryan finally made up his mind. He had to speak to Laura. Really speak to her, not just go through the motions. He needed answers, and maybe more than that, he needed closure. He found her in the kitchen, quietly washing dishes, her back turned to him. The soft hum of the water running filled the room, but there was a deafening silence between them. Laura, Ryan said, his voice softer than usual. She turned to look at him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I'm sorry for what happened, he continued, his gaze not quite meeting hers. But I need to know, can we fix this? Or are we too far gone? Laura looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Ryan could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of their broken marriage hanging there between them. She opened her mouth to speak but then paused, as if considering how to best explain the complexities of her emotions. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive myself, she said finally, her voice wavering. But I've spent so many nights thinking about us, about what happened, and I know I made mistakes. I don't want to lose you, Ryan. I want to try. I just don't know how. Ryan took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the moment. It was as if the whole world had been standing still, waiting for him to make the decision that would shape the rest of his life. He couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something new. I think we both made mistakes, he said, his voice steady now. And I've been blind to a lot of things. But I don't want to give up either. I want to try too. For us, for Lucas. There was a long silence between them, but this time it felt different. It felt like a turning point, a chance to heal the wounds they had both inflicted on each other. It wasn't going to be easy, and there was no guarantee that things would go back to how they once were. But for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt like they had a chance. A chance to rebuild their relationship, to start over from the ashes. The following weeks were not without their struggles. Laura and Ryan attended therapy together, a step they should have taken years ago. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but they slowly began to rebuild their relationship, one conversation at a time. Ryan made an effort to be more present in their marriage, spending more time with Laura and Lucas, prioritizing their family over work. It was a slow process, but they were both determined to make it work. Ryan also found himself confronting his own demons. He had spent so much of his life wrapped up in his career that he had lost sight of the most important things: his wife, his son, and the life they had built together. He had neglected them, and he couldn't change that, but he could start doing better. And that was exactly what he did. As for Doug, he disappeared from their lives. After the confrontation with Ryan, he stopped contacting Laura. There was no grand moment of reconciliation, no dramatic fight. Doug simply vanished from their lives, as if he had never been a part of it. It was a quiet exit, but it was exactly what Ryan had hoped for. Laura never spoke of him again, and Ryan didn't need to know the details. Doug's role in their story had come to an end, and now it was time for Ryan and Laura to write their own chapter, free from the shadow of betrayal. Several months later, as Ryan sat at the dinner table with Laura and Lucas, he realized that their lives were starting to feel normal again. The wounds hadn't fully healed, and maybe they never would. But they were moving forward together, and that was enough. Ryan looked at Laura across the table, a sense of peace settling over him. They had both learned painful lessons from the mistakes they made, but they had also learned the value of forgiveness, of second chances. They weren't perfect, and their marriage would never be the same as it once was, but they had something far more important: understanding and a willingness to fight for each other. "Here's to second chances," Ryan said, raising his glass. "To second chances," Laura echoed, her smile warm and sincere. And as they clinked their glasses together, Ryan knew that this was just the beginning of their new chapter. A chapter where they would rebuild, one step at a time. Thanks for sticking with us through this journey. If you want to see more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We've got more coming your way soon. Don't miss out.